I felt from the off, I mean, the reason I got involved with this whole referendum is that, having never been political or done anything like this before, is that Brexit was pretty crudely and clumsily portrayed as inward-looking, nativist, bigoted, and it frustrated me greatly, because my contention then, and it's a contention and actually now a worry that I still have today, is that Brexit is really about the opportunity to expand overall trade. During the course of those debates, there was a real dichotomy between what was going on nationally. Nationally, we had this pretty ham-fisted, quite nasty, tribal campaign of spin and, the 350 million and the 4,300 and all that sort of nonsense. Both sides as bad as the other, both sides as misleading as each other. But compared to what was going on in the local debates, in the town halls, in the chambers of commerce debates, it was far more balanced. It was far more reasonable. There were many people who were 60-40, one way or the other. The discussions were reasoned. And importantly, people understood the uncertainties. They got that. They got the fact that there were shades of grey. And I got the sense, I did most of them here in Norwich, that even though Norwich was a place that ultimately voted to remain, that the Leave side was making headway. Even I did a few debates in Cambridge, even in places like sixth form colleges in Cambridge, a demographic and a geography that's pretty bad for the Leave campaign. There was a sense of momentum there. So I wasn't particularly surprised about the result when we had it, because I got a feel from more local discussions that seemed very different to what was going on nationally and what we were hearing from the pollsters at the time. So how did the result come about? Economists, of whom there are far more qualified people on the panel than I, refer to this concept of a black swan event, a situation or something that's extremely difficult to predict. It feels to me that 2016 black swans are becoming white swans, because the rules of the game are changing. It feels that there's almost we're entering a post-liberal era. It's like the 1960s in reverse. And I'm thinking of the three P's: patriotism, protectionism and populism. So patriotism as this corrective to globalisation seems to be making a comeback, doesn't it? We've had Brexit, we've had Donald Trump, you've got the SNP in Scotland, you've got Putin in Russia. So whilst the Brexit vote feels or felt like this black swan event to the mainstream media, with hindsight, of course, it isn't. The result was about globalisation more than it was about the EU. The rise of China over the last 30 years, 1.3 billion people joining the global workforce. And if you just take one example of a business that I'm involved in, which is the manufacture of electronic goods. 30 years ago, the Chinese manufactured no electronic goods. Last year, they manufactured 50% of the world's electronic goods. Think of the impact that has on semi-skilled and unskilled labour in the Western world. That's what this, I think, has been mainly about. The other P, protectionism, and this shifting trend away from the inviolable sanctity of the free market. This has come about after the 2008 financial crisis we've seen, and the MP's expenses scandal, I think. We saw manifestations, Donald Trump building a wall or a fence or whatever he calls it, talking about being raped by China, thinking of Corbyn, thinking of Cameron's offer to nationalise or part nationalise our steel industry, or Theresa May recently talking about industrial strategies. Those last two are things that Tory prime ministers in the 80s and 90s wouldn't have been heard of saying. So we're getting a shift to protectionism, which I'm slightly concerned about, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the final P, populism, which is the new swear word of the political commentariat. If you're not happy with anything, then it's the result of populism winning the day, and I can understand that. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's always been populism. There's always been people who are unhappy with elements of particular political decisions in their lives or that affect their communities. And that's going to be more the case when we have global economic uncertainties that we've had in recent years. So I think we've had this sort of melting pot giving us this liberal elite, crony capitalism, lack of trust in the establishment. You've read all about this stuff. And as well as that, we've had the constant march of innovation and an ageing population. So I think that's why we got to where we got to. And I said this emergence of protectionism is the thing that really worries me. And I think that's the thing that worries most of the SME business owners that I speak to in the region. It never works, protectionism in the long term. And I think we will see quite a few more black or white swans in the coming few months and years that will originate in the USA, in China, in the European Union. I think we've got a pretty key vote in Italy coming up, and it's causing this dreaded uncertainty. And that's the thing that political and business commentators always talk about. Business hates uncertainty. So what about SMEs here in the region? So taking a step back, we've got about 5.5 million private sector businesses in this country. 99.9% of those are small businesses, and they employ about 60% of all private sector employment in the UK, something like 16 million people. These are businesses here in East Anglia that I work with day in and day out. They're people who put their own money at risk. They're people that employ proportionally 60% of the private sector workforce. And they tend to concern themselves, believe it or not, with paying their suppliers, with paying the wages at the end of the month, with paying their employees and collecting their debts. And that's about it. And believe it or not, that's a pretty 24/7 job for these people. What are these people doing about this uncertainty? Well, they're just getting on with it, as they always do. Apart from one very special thing, SMEs are broadly the same. They all have accounting functions, they all have marketing departments and sales departments, HR teams. They're all small. The thing that distinguishes them, that makes them unique and compelling, is the aspect that the individual owner, him or herself, brings to the table. And it might sound pretty obvious, but the CBI, the IOD with whom I've been involved, the chambers, the experts, the OECD, the IMF, the Bank of England, the Treasury, they don't get that. They just don't get that. More than ever, business owners need to be clear and confident about this uniqueness that makes their businesses distinct and compelling. And this needs to be fully understood, I think, before we even start to assess the external environment. For many SMEs, for most in this region, in a global context, their market share is frankly so small that the wider economy has virtually no impact, except in one very important way. If the owner's confidence is knocked, then it can really set them off course. So it does worry me a little bit that Philip Hammond is not by nature, it seems, an optimist. He seems a bit of a miserable git, if I can say that. Confidence is so important. So what do I think will happen next? So as and when Parliament approves the sending of this letter to quit, we'll have this 2-year transition phase. It's not clear what arrangements will be in place, but it is very likely on the basis of mutual self-interest that we'll reach some sort of sensible agreement. From the time the letter's sent until the date that the EU agree our departure, it's 2017, 2020, that sort of period. That's when we have, I think, the uncertainty. That's when that period becomes most magnified. And I hope, personally, I hope Theresa May will indicate pretty early on what kind of deal she wants to obtain. You're right, I think it will require clarity on the control of immigration issue. I think that's a non-negotiable point politically. So that leaves the WTO option, the hard Brexit, which some of us are calling for government just to crack on with. We understand that very few of these deals are bilateral. They prefer unilateral agreements, so it's a collective agreement with the EU rather than with individual members. It will take many years to obtain, and meanwhile we have this significant current account trade deficit to finance, and that's where there is a risk to our growth. We need to balance the current account deficit with a surplus on the capital account of the same sort of size, and since 1984 that's been achieved from overseas long-term capital inflows. You know, when a US company or a European company decides to buy a British business or to invest in a British business. And they want to do that because we're typically the least of the regulated economies of the EU, we have a flexible workforce and so on. And I don't know what the EU and the US are going to do, but this is quite an interesting area where Mr. Trump could be quite good for us in terms of maintaining that. But if they do reduce their investment flow, we'll have to finance that deficit some other way, probably short-term capital borrowing on the markets. Money moves around the world as to where it can get the best return, be that Frankfurt, Paris, New York, Tokyo, or wherever else. If we decide that cheaper currency is the best way, the Bank of England doesn't raise its interest rates, then we'll have this further pound falling in value, time lags, and inflation, and that's where there's the risk of recession. Difficult to say when. I think possibly 2020. We had a recession in 1973 with the oil crisis, then in 1980 with Geoffrey Howe and the pursuit of monetarism, Nigel Lawson's boom 1990, the credit crunch 2008. So on average, every 12 years, a recession. We're due a recession. Yeah, 12 years plus 2008 is 2020. Can we avoid it? I'm less pessimistic than some of the other panel members. I think we can. I think it's in our gift. Because I think just as business owners need to be clear and confident about what makes their businesses special, so too our government must be about the UK. One thing Philip Hammond should start doing, in my opinion, is talking very openly about what options there are if there is no exit deal with the EU. He should make it clear that we would not stand by and be passive, that we would enact some pretty radical measures to make ourselves more competitive if we're driven back into the WTO rules. So you could think of what, for example, what's been made of the financial institutions in this country. What could we do to seek a deal that we have the right to stay in a single market for financial services? If that can't be achieved, then let's hack away at the regulations. Let's remove the cap on bankers' bonuses. Let's change corporation tax on banks. Let's get that message out there. Because if we are able to do that, that's exactly what other partners in the EU would expect and fear that we might do. It would help make a deal more possibly. And similarly, you can give such thought to other industries such as automotive. There's quite a bit that can be done in terms of a forceful supply-side growth strategy. We could play with our VAT regime, for example. So there's quite a lot we can do and we can be fairly positive about if we are proactive about it. If 2020 comes and my predicted recession doesn't happen because the EU is willing to do a deal with us, give us market access in certain areas, allows us to limit immigration as seems to be politically a prerogative now, then I think the long-term investment will continue to flow and there won't be a recession. I suppose what I see is there's an opportunity now for us to embrace the spirit of thousands of, all those 5 or 6 million businesses scouring the world to secure deals and trade. That's the opportunity. The alternative is we become a low growth, low opportunity country, a bit like Japan. But I'm positive that that is unlikely. And I'll tell you why. I just want to finish, Olga, if it's okay, by just reading something from a private website called Just Landed that I found. And this is their description of the British for visitors. The British enjoy superb entertainment, leisure, sports and cultural facilities, which for their sheer variety and accessibility are among the best in the world. The quality and huge choice of goods in the shops is excellent and explains why many people travel from far and wide to shop in Britain. Television here has no equal. National and local radio is excellent. Unrivaled choice of newspapers, magazines and literature. The UK is a caring society. There's an abundance of charitable and voluntary organisations unparalleled in any other country. The UK remains a centre of scientific excellence, underlined by its number of Nobel Prize winners. It's one of the least corrupt and most civilised countries in the world. The British have more freedom from government interference than people of most countries do, most of which we take for granted. The UK is still a great enlightened power and a positive influence in the world, and London remains the centre of the English-speaking world. Whilst whatever life else might be, the UK is spiritually, mentally, intellectually stimulating and rarely dull. Although foreigners may occasionally complain about the weather, most feel they privileged to live here and work here and wouldn't dream of leaving. Successful business owners are not afraid to stand up for the business and to shout about what it is that makes them great. I think we need to adopt that sort of ethos for the UK. We need to be clear and confident about the behaviours that make our country distinctive and compelling. I agree it'll be a challenge. I think there'll be dark moments, but I do feel it has to be the right option in the long term for the wealth and security of our country. Thank you.